Hello, good evening. Today I'm going to talk to you about how meditation impacts the brain. And so often when people first start practicing, hold on, I need to hide everybody so I can see myself and see the slides. There we go. All right. So often when people first start practicing meditation, they very quickly start to say that they feel calmer even when they're not meditating, and that they're more focused, they're more relaxed, they're better able to handle difficult emotions. And this happened to me when I first started practicing. And for me, being a scientist, I felt that how I was interacting with the world was changing. And so I thought that something about my brain had changed, right? That because I felt like even when I wasn't meditating, that it was having impact on me. And so I want to understand, how does meditation change the brain? And so the questions that I've asked and what I'm showing you tonight is, can meditation actually change the structure of our brains? And the short answer is yes. But now I'm going to go into detail about how it does, how it happens, and how quickly it happens. So one of the studies we did is we took people who were going through an 8-week meditation training for stress reduction, and we looked at the structure of their brain before and after this 8-week program, and we compared it to people who we just scanned 8 weeks apart but didn't do anything in between. And what we found was that there were several brain regions where there's more gray matter after 8 weeks compared to prior to training. What are these regions? So this is a posterior cingulate. It's involved in mind wandering. I'll come back to that in a moment. This is the supramarginal gyrus. It's involved in perspective taking and attention. So deciding where I'm going to put attention. I'm going to put attention inside my body, or I'm going to pay attention to the external world. This is the part of the brain that's making that decision, or part of the brain that's making the decision. And then the hippocampus is involved in memory. And what we know is that these three regions together form something called the default network. And the default network is the part of the brain that's active when you're not thinking about anything particular, like when you're mind wandering. And you might think, these are all things that should be shut off. Your mind wandering should be shut off when you're meditating. And what we know is that sometimes brain structure means more activity, and sometimes more brain structure means less activity. And so we think in this case that more brain structure means that these regions are being turned off. And we know that this is the case. We know from other studies that these regions get turned off when we meditate. And so we think that these changes in brain structure are shutting them off. We know that this region, in particular in the hippocampus, the PCC and the hippocampus, are destroyed in Alzheimer's disease. And one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's is, constant mind wandering. Like you're unable to focus. And so both of these together are suggestive that this is beneficial, these increases in the gray matter here and here. We also found down in the brainstem that this area increased and that the change correlated with well-being. So the more this area changed, the more people said that they were happier and satisfied with their life. And then the final change we found was here in the amygdala. Amygdala is the part of the brain that's responsible for emotions, particularly negative emotions, fear and anger, these sorts of emotions. And what we saw is that it was getting smaller, and that the change in the amygdala correlated with changes in stress. So the more stress reduction people reported, the smaller the amygdala became. So this was over the course of just 8 weeks. Many people practice for years. And so we also did a study where we looked at the brains of people who had been meditating for many, many years, and we compared them to people who had never practiced before. And we saw that there were several brain regions where there's more gray matter in the long-term meditators compared to the controls. And this main region we see here, this is involved the insula. This is involved in awareness of visceral processes. So breathing, heart rate, hunger, these sorts of things. It's also involved in integrating thoughts, senses, and emotions. And it's deciding what the salience, how important these signals are. We also found this brain region here in the front of the brain. This is an area involved in working memory and attention, and something called fluid intelligence. I'm going to talk a lot more about fluid intelligence in a few minutes. What was interesting is that when we actually plotted the data, this is what we saw. So the red squares are the controls, and the blue dots are the meditators. And it's well established that as we get older, our brain gets thinner. We start to lose gray matter, and the thickness gets thinner. And this is why, as we get older, it takes us a little longer to figure things out, or we're not quite as sharp as we used to be. And they've shown us because of the gray matter shrinking. And what was interesting was we saw was that, as you can see, that in these regions, so the red decrease in the controls, this is completely normal, right? This is what many, many, many studies have demonstrated, is that as we get older, it gets thinner. But what we see is that the 50-year-old meditators had the same amount of gray matter as the 25-year-olds, suggesting that somehow it's helping preserve this region with aging. And here in the insula, both groups went down, but the meditation group went down more slowly than the controls. Versus here, it seems like there's no loss whatsoever. So we thought this was rather interesting. And so we wondered, well, so it's preserving the gray matter, but is it actually preserving anything useful? Like, are we actually preserving cognition? So we did another study where we asked, where we looked at people with training, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But first, I want to tell you a little bit more about how we thought about this. So we know that mindfulness meditation, that one of the common definitions of mindfulness meditation is paying attention to the present moment on purpose without judgment. And that first part, paying attention to the present moment, is really important, right? Because it's a lot of people have described meditation as a form of mental training, because you're sitting there and you're paying attention to your breath, and it gets kind of boring, right? And so your mind starts to wander off. And so you have to pay attention. Oh, wait, hold on a second. My mind's wandering. Got to bring it back. And then you're breathing, and then your mind starts to wander again. Oh, my mind wandered again. Got to bring it back. And so this idea that it's a way of training your attention, right? And so there's the sustained attention, but there's also what's referred to as meta-awareness, which is being able to watch your thoughts, being able to sort of step back and sort of see your thoughts as just thoughts. And so there's that part of your mind that's aware that you're thinking, right? And it's also holding in mind the intention to stay focused while monitoring for the random thoughts, right? So that the little thought comes up, and then you just let it go before your mind goes wandering off with it. And then you also have to remember to maintain this attitude of non-judging and receptive openness. So mindfulness, you're not just sitting there, right? It's a very active process, because you're paying attention, and you're paying attention to the fact that you're paying attention, and you're keeping in mind all these, to do this non-judgmentally. So this is why it's called mental training. So we know that mindfulness is really good at decreasing stress. There's been many, 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 many studies showing it decreases stress, both self-reported stress and also biomarkers of stress like cortisol. It's really effective for reducing symptoms of depression, anxiety, pain, and insomnia. And in the second half of my talk, I'm going to be talking about pain and anxiety. But what you don't hear about too much is that it also helps cognition. There have been several studies now demonstrating that it actually improves attention. It also improves memory. So episodic memory is just like facts and figures, like, what I ate for lunch yesterday, right? Or, memories from my childhood. Working memory is more related to problem solving, right? And so I got information, and it's, so it's in my mind, and I'm keeping it in mind as I think about things. And mental flexibility is very important, because it's, if I'm working on one task and then I need to suddenly shift and work on something else, my ability to disengage from this and re-engage in this other task, right? That's what mental flexibility is. And so all of these cognitive abilities have been shown to be better in long-term meditators versus control, or to improve after 8 weeks of training. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about intelligence, right? So I told you before that that part of the brain that's preserved in the long-term meditators is involved in fluid intelligence. So there's many different kinds of intelligence. There is crystallized intelligence, which is just all the information you've ever learned. And then fluid intelligence is the ability to reason and think and solve problems. And what we know is that as we get older, just the information from our life grows, and so we gather more and more and more information, and it stays fairly stable over our lifetime. When we get into our 70s and 80s, we might start to have some loss of our knowledge, but for the most part, it stays pretty stable. Fluid intelligence, not so much. Fluid intelligence peaks in our 20s and 30s, and then it's all downhill from there, right? And so we're still able to do it, but it takes us a little bit longer, and we're not quite as sharp again. And again, this is what's related to that front part of the brain that's shrinking with age. And so what we wondered was, and fluid intelligence is multifaceted. And so it's sustained attention, it's working memory, it's this metacognitive awareness, and other executive functions. And so we wondered, okay, could we actually demonstrate this? Could we actually, does meditation actually enhance fluid intelligence? And so again, this is the part of the brain that we found. And again, these are the parts of the brain, you can see these are studies that have mapped fluid intelligence. And this is the part of the brain that is most related to fluid intelligence from a bunch of different studies. And again, this is the part of the brain that shrinks with age, but is preserved in the long-term meditators. And so what we did is we recruited more subjects, and everyone in our second study was between the ages of 40 and 70. And we gave them the standard test of fluid intelligence. And I should say, fluid intelligence is sometimes referred to as IQ, right? So this is when we think about intelligence, what we're really talking about is fluid intelligence. And so what we can see in the controls is that as they got older, the performance went down, which again is very well established. We had long-term meditators and also long-term yoga practitioners. And what we see is that in both of those groups, their intelligence was preserved with older age. So it does go down a little bit over the course of the 30 years, but not very much, right? And there's no longer relationship between age and intelligence, versus here with the controls, there's a very strong inverse correlation between age and intelligence. So it really does suggest that these practices can actually help preserve our intelligence as we get older. So this is nice. All these people in this study have been practicing for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But next the question was, well, what if, I'm in my 50s and 60s and 70s and I've never, ever meditated before? Can I do anything about my memory? Can it actually help me? And so what we did is we recruited 120 healthy older adults. They were all 65 to 80 years old. And we screened to make sure that there was no dementia, right? And there's nothing, there was no strokes or anything like that could impact their cognition. They had no prior experience with yoga or meditation. And we randomized them to either mindfulness training or to brain games. And so brain games were things like Sudoku or crossword puzzles and these sorts of games. And so both classes met for 8 weeks. And they were told to practice every day for 40 minutes. So the meditation group practiced meditation every day for 40 minutes. And the brain games practiced the crossword puzzles and Sudoku every day for 40 minutes. And we tested them at baseline, at the end of the 8 weeks, and also at 12 and 24 months. And what we saw was that indeed, so from before to after, both groups improved in fluid intelligence, right? But then afterwards, at 1 year, the controls had gone back down to baseline versus the meditation group. Not only had they maintained, they actually got even better at fluid intelligence over the course of the 12 months. So it really shows that, as you continue practicing, it has more and more benefits for you. And both groups continue to practice. In fact, the controls actually practice more than the meditators. And so it really seems that just practicing, even 3 or 4 times a week, because a lot of the people stopped practicing every day. They only practice, say, 3 or 4 times a week. Some practiced every day. But definitely just doing any sort of practice whatsoever helped increase their intelligence over the course of the next 12 months. And so the question was, okay, well, how is this working? So I told you that intelligence is comprised of attention and working memory and other things. And so what we also did is give them a test of sustained attention. And again, what we see is from pre to post, both groups improved. The controls kind of sort of remained going for 12 months, but then they started to lose it. Versus the meditation group continued to increase over the course of 24 months. When we looked more closely at this data, what we saw is this. It's a little bit complicated, so I'll just walk you through it. So this is at baseline in the meditation group. And this is so it's a 16-minute task. And so they start off, doing pretty well in the task, but it's a boring task. And so after about 5-10 minutes, their performance starts to drop off. And by 15 minutes, their performance has dropped off quite a bit. This is at baseline. At the end of the 8 weeks, they're doing a little bit better. They start off higher, but they still dropped off pretty much the same. But what's interesting is that at 1 year and 2 year, their ability to maintain their performance over the course of the 16 minutes was much better preserved, right? So if we draw lines over this, what we see is that, here, they couldn't even maintain their attention over 16 minutes. And so not only is the overall performance getting higher, but they're also able to maintain it for a longer period, right? And so if you've ever something really boring, that, after 5 or 10 minutes, you're bored and you start to get distracted. And what this is really showing is that, no, they're able to actually preserve, for longer periods compared to baseline. In the controls, we didn't see this. The rate of decline was the same at baseline as at 24 months. So they never gained the ability to flatten the curve. So this really helps us understand how it is that meditation is helping preserve fluid intelligence. Because what we're seeing is that it's both increasing your ability to pay attention, and it's also helping you to pay attention for longer periods of time continuously, right? So you don't get tired and you don't get mentally tired so much. Okay, so that's cognition. So now we're going to switch to talk about stress, anxiety, and pain. So the definition I mentioned of mindfulness is perfectly paying attention to experiences in the present moment in a non-judgmental way. And I want to pay attention to that last bit, the non-judging. So another word I'd like for non-judging is equanimity. And so what is equanimity? Equanimity is a sense of balance, the sense that, it doesn't matter what's happening. Can I be okay? Can I be balanced regardless of what's happening? Doesn't matter if really wonderful things are happening or really horrible things are balancing. Can I maintain my balance? And it's very important that it's not that you're indifferent, right? It's not like, oh yeah, whatever happens. Equanimity, there's a deep sense of caring, right? So you care that someone has been injured, or you care that, things are not going well in the world right now. It's, but you can still remain non-reactive and equanimous, right? And this is really what we're trying to cultivate with mindfulness meditation. So it's this very even-minded and relaxed and open awareness. And the question is, can we actually show this? Can we actually demonstrate this in the brain? And so I'm going to talk about pain and anxiety as examples of this. So the first study was done by my student, Tim Gard. And so first, let's talk about pain and how pain is processed in the brain. So here's a brain, here's the front of the brain, right? Here's your eyeball. And so what happens is, say you cooking and you burn your finger. The painful stimulus will come in through your fingers into the spinal cord. It goes up the spinal cord into the part of the brain called the thalamus. And then there's two components of pain. One component of pain is the actual sensory experience of the pain. So the burning, stabbing, tingling, throbbing, right? There's that component of the pain. The other component of the pain is that, ow, I don't like it. Why did this happen to me? Make it stop, right? So there's the emotional component of the pain. And what we see is that this blue network is primarily the sensory component of it, right? So there's the burning sensation itself. And then here in the front of the brain is this, again, this executive control network that turns off, I'm jumping ahead, sorry, which is related to the I don't like it, make it stop, right? And what we know is that there's lots of different ways to control pain. So I can distract you. I can manage your expectations and say, oh, this isn't going to hurt, right? Yeah, there's going to be a little bit of pinch, but, like when the doctor gives you a shot, like, oh, there's going to be a little pinch of pain, but it's nothing, no big deal. Or I can use a placebo. I can put a cream on you and say, hey, there's something in this cream that's going to block the pain. In reality, there's nothing there, but if you believe me, you'll report there's less pain. And what we know is that in all three of these cases, what happens is that the front of the brain literally shuts off this part of the brain, the sensory part of the brain, so that when the information comes up, you just don't feel it. It just doesn't come into the sensory network. And so you don't feel the pain because it's not being processed. So the question is, what happens with meditation? Because I know that meditation is useful for helping with pain. So what we did is we put people in the scanner and we applied a very mild electric shock to their hand. And so we had them just lie there and we said, okay, you're just going to be, for the next minute or 40 seconds, you're going to be shocked periodically. And they didn't know when the shock was happening. And then afterwards, they were asked to rate it, both the intensity of the pain and the unpleasantness, right? So both the sensation of it and the emotional reaction to it on a 10-point scale. And what we saw is that here's the front of the brain. So now we're looking from above. Here's the front of the brain, right? This is the part of the brain that shuts off sensory cortex. And we see is in the controls that, so first we did this in a normal state, and then we said, do this in a mindful state. And the controls, they didn't know what mindfulness was. So we just said to them before they went in the scanner, okay, well, just be aware of it, and try to be aware of it. And what we saw is that in their mindful state, which was not very mindful, that they turned on this part of the brain, versus the mindfulness practitioners is actually the other way around. They turned this part of the brain off, right? So this is the, I don't like it, make it stop, right? So literally brain this comes on to shut off sensory cortex. What was interesting is now here we got sensory cortex, right? So this is the part of the brain that's actually evaluating, okay, what am I feeling? And what we see is that in the controls, it gets turned off, right? So the front of the brain did its job and it shut it off a bit. But in the mindfulness practitioners, we're actually seeing increased activity, right? So that they're actually feeling it more. And so now when we first did the study, we thought, isn't this interesting? What's going on here? But then we remembered the instructions for mindfulness. Mindfulness is pay attention to the sensory experience in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And this is exactly what we're seeing, right? So they're paying attention, they're paying attention to it more, and, oops, go back. They're doing it non-judgmentally, right? So this is the judgy, I don't like it, make it stop, right? So they've turned this off and they've turned up the sensory cortex. But amazingly, they reported no change in the intensity, right? So even though they were feeling it more, they didn't say that they were feeling it more, and they said that the unpleasantness was less. So even though they're feeling it more, like the more of the sensory signal is coming through, they're saying, yeah, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's not as unpleasant as it was when I wasn't meditating, right? And so this is equanimity. right? So here it is, they're really feeling it. It's not indifference. They're really feeling it. They're really letting the emotions in, or the sensory experience in. And yet it's not so bad, right? And so we can now see this in the brain. What was interesting is that the more experience the people had, the more years of meditation practice they had, the more they turned off the front of the brain, right? So that part of the brain, the better ability to turn that off occurred with the more meditation practice. So to wrap up this part of the talk, life is painful, suffering is optional, right? And this is really important because no matter how much you meditate, sometimes you're going to encounter pain in your life, right? Either physical pain or emotional pain. We cannot change the pain, right? We cannot stop the pain, but we can change our relationship to the pain, right? And so this is what this is saying, is that, yeah, we're going to experience pain no matter what. Meditation will not stop that. But meditation helps us not suffer because of the pain, right? We don't have to go around saying, oh, this hurts so much, I wish it would stop. We can just be, okay, there's some pain there, and can I be okay with it? And that's really important. And it's a big part of what meditation can do for us. So now this is pain. What about fear? What about emotional pain? So for this study, this was my postdoc Gunesh. And what we did was, I'm going to skip through this. What we did is we put people through a 2-day fear conditioning protocol. And I'll go through and explain this as we go along. And what we did, so this was at baseline. And this, then we randomized them to either 8 weeks of mindfulness training or 8 weeks of exercise and diet. And then we repeated this fear conditioning protocol in the scanner. And very importantly, because I think I showed you in my prior study, there was no control group, right? We just had, or this control group, but they just were scanned 8 weeks apart. But in this study, we thought it was really important because we wanted to know, how is meditation different than other forms of stress reduction? Because we know that exercise is very, very good for reducing stress. But the question is all stress reduction the same, right? Is meditation the same as exercise? So, is there a reason, why should we meditate? If exercise is good for reducing stress, why do we need to meditate? And so everyone was told that there's no control group and that both interventions were beneficial. And this is true because exercise is well known to reduce stress. The exercise group also got information about sleep and diet and positive attitude and humor. And both groups were instructed to practice 40 minutes per day at home. So the mindfulness group practiced meditation for 40 minutes a day. The exercise group exercised 40 minutes a day. And both groups reduced stress. So this is the mindfulness group, this is the control group. And as you can see, they're both very stressed and they both reduced their stress the same amount, right? Now the question is it the same in the brain? First, what I should say, so it also, in both groups, what we saw was that the more they practiced, the more stress reduction they reported. So this is a question I get a lot, like, how much do I need to practice? And the short answer is the more you practice, the more you're going to benefit. So now, what's this fear conditioning? So you probably heard about Pavlov's dogs, right? And so normally, when a dog sees a bone, it's going to salivate. When a dog hears a bell, it's just a bell. There's no response. But if every time you feed the dog a bone, you also ring the bell, the dog learns that the bell means it's going to get food. And so then after a while, what will happen is that if you ring the bell, the dog will start to salivate even if you don't give it food, right? So this is called conditioning, where you pair something which produces a biological response with something that doesn't. And then you see how do we respond, right? How well have we learned the connection between the food and the bell? So now we did this, but instead of doing foods and bells, we did that mild electric shock again, paired with lights. So they were in the scanner and they saw these lights, and depending on what color light they saw, they got a mild electric shock. So they learned that the lights meant they were going to get shocked, right? And so this is a very well-established way of inducing fear because people don't like being shocked. And so the way it looks is this, is that it's a 2-day protocol. So on the first day, first of all, they see 3 different colored lights. And 2 of the colors, in this case, red and yellow, they get the shock. But the blue light, they don't get shocked. Blue light means they're safe. And I'll talk about the next 2 parts in a little bit. So the first question is just, okay, what changes from pre to post during when they're actually getting shocked? And what we see is this. And again, it's a little complicated, so I'll talk you through it. So with the controls, from baseline, this is the red light. This is the light that they're getting shocked to. This is the light they're not getting shocked to. So you can see that they're having a big, this is skin conductance. They're having a big reaction to being shocked, which is normal, right? After the 8 weeks, they no longer responded that way, right? They responded more than not getting shocked, but almost no difference between getting shocked and not getting shocked. Meanwhile, in the mindfulness group, there's almost no change from pre to post. And again, we thought, what's going on here? But then we remembered what happened with the pain, right? Because what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is being open and non-reactive and allowing and accepting. And what we see is this is what happens, is that after the 8 weeks, the controls, they remember that they're going to get shocked. And so instead of being open, they shut down and they're like, okay, I'm just not going to feel it. And so they didn't feel it, right? That front of the brain turned off their sensory cortex and they just didn't feel it. Versus after just 8 weeks, the meditation group learned not to do that. And what we saw is that the more pre and post look the same, so again, this is our equanimity, the more they look the same, the more stress reduction people reported. So the more they looked like this, the more stress people had. The more they looked like this, the less stress people reported at post. So it really does show that being open and equanimous, to this pain is related to stress in everyday life, right? It really does translate. The physical, being okay with physical pain relates to emotional pain as well, right? So that's the first part of it. So now what else happens? So first they learn the red and yellow light means they're going to get shocked. Then what we do is we show them the red light, but we don't shock them. And they also don't get shocked to the blue light. But they get no more information about the yellow light. They go home, they go to bed, they come back the second day. And then the second day we show them all 3 lights, but we don't shock them. And the question is, how do they respond to the red light versus the yellow and the blue light, right? So if they have learned this well, then the red light should look like the blue light, versus if they've forgotten, then they're going to look like the yellow light. And why do we care about this? So this needs to be remembered, right? And we know that memory is supposed to be remembered, and we know that that the hippocampus, right, which is one of the regions we saw changing from pre to post, is important for this, right? And we know that people with anxiety and depression have difficulty remembering this. So what happens is that people, let me go back here, people with anxiety and depression forget from day 1 to day 2. So when we bring people with anxiety and depression back, they respond like as if they're still getting shocked. They've forgotten that the red light means they're safe. Versus healthy, normal people are able to remember, okay, red light means I'm safe now. And so the red light looks like blue light. Versus people with anxiety and depression, red light looks like yellow light. And it's all dependent on the hippocampus. So the question was, okay, well, what happens with MBSR, with the training? And what we see is that indeed, the mindfulness group was better able to remember that the red light meant that they were not going to get shocked compared to the controls. So the controls kind of sort of remembered it, but not really, versus the mindfulness group did, and there's a group difference between the two, right? And then again, the question is, what's happening in the brain? So this is a region that are more active in the meditators, and this is the area of the hand, right? So this is where, so this is on the second day, they're not actually getting shocked, but what's active And what is attached to the hippocampus is this region here, which is the hand. And so they're paying attention to their hand while they're lying there, even though they're not getting shocked. They're still paying attention to the hand. And they're not paying attention to this region. This is the area that is more active in the controls versus the meditators. And this is visual cortex, right? So the controls were paying more attention to the lights versus the meditators are paying more attention to their actual hand. And the third region we found difference, and this was related to anxiety, and this is well established, that the more people are paying attention to the lights and the more the visual cortex is active, the more anxiety there is. And so the more this was turned off, the better. And then the third reason we found was this SMG, which again is one of these regions that changes after just 8 weeks. And what we saw is that it was more active in the mindfulness group compared to the controls. And if you recall, this is an area that's involved in deciding, do I pay attention to the outside world or the inside world? And so what we think is happening is that before and after meditation, what's happening is that this area is turning on and better trained and is saying, okay, pay attention to the sensory cortex and don't pay attention to visual cortex. And this way, then we can control and be more aware of, right? So paying attention to the present moment experience, the actual sensory experience, as opposed to the external world, which may or may not be giving you useful information. And so the conclusion is that the mindfulness of the body is important both for pain and fear coping, and that we're shifting from thinking about and defending against threat to experiencing it openly and with equanimity, right? And that this is important for reducing stress and anxiety, right? Just by being open to life rather than shutting down. And so I want to end with a quote from Joseph Goldstein, who's a very famous teacher here in the States. He says, "Anything can happen anytime. We may be going along just fine in our lives, and suddenly there's an accident or an illness or some dramatic change in the conditions of the world. Some people may hear anything can happen anytime and think, oh, that's depressing. But rightly understood, is not depressing at all. It's freeing because in understanding this, we are not living in delusion. The mind relaxes, lets go of fear, and is much more open because we acknowledge the truth of change rather than deny it, right? And now let's think about this, this was actually written before COVID, right? And so, and as we saw over the past few years, that it's true, we can go along and all of a sudden something dramatic can happen, right? COVID or another strain of COVID or, wars and all sorts of horrible things can happen. Anything can happen anytime. We like to think that, oh yes, our life is going along and we've, everything's all set and everything's gonna be just perfect. But then something like COVID happens and it's like, oh no, right? And we're completely thrown off by it. But if we're open to it and saying, yeah, no, I understand life, this is how life is. And that right now, maybe everything's good, but something could happen and won't, right? And when you really are able to do that in a really profound way, then, this is the truth, right? We're not living in delusion. We're living in truth, and our mind relaxes and let's go of the fear, right? And so we're much more able to deal with things like COVID and war and, all the other, climate change and all the other things that are happening in our life when we just acknowledge that this is what is true, right? So we're not trying to shut things down with the front of our brain saying, I don't like this, make it stop. We're just open to how things are. And so with that, I will say thank you. And we have some time for questions.
네, 감사합니다. 사라 라자르 교수님. 몸에 대한 마음 챙김은 그 통증 대처와 공포 대처에 공통적으로 그 핵심적이라는 결론을 전달해 주셨습니다. 지금부터 10분간 질의응답 시간을 갖도록 하겠는데요. 아까 말씀드렸듯이 그 사전 질문을 통해서 많은 질문이 들어와 있습니다. 그 중에서 몇 가지 질문을 추려서 교수님께 여쭤보도록 하겠습니다. 첫 번째 질문인데요. 박사님께서는 그 개인적 수행과 연구도 병행하시고 계시는데요. 이 두 가지를 동시에 하시면서 그 연구에 어떤 도움을 받고 계십니까?
How meditation helps me. So I practice, yes. Um, and it definitely helps a lot because it helps me understand. It helps me understand what's going on. You know, other people will say, "Oh, this is what I experienced," but by experiencing it myself, I'm better able to design my experiments and to have a sense of what's possible. Um, you know, because there's some people who just study people who've been practicing for many, many years. Many of my studies are looking at just 8 weeks. And so I think it's important to understand what's capable of changing in 8 weeks versus what's going to happen more slowly over many years. And so I think that's part of how my practice helps me. Also, I've practiced both meditation and yoga, and I've practiced a couple of different types of meditation. And, you know, there's some people who say it's all the same. You know, meditation, yoga, this, you know, Buddhism, Hinduism, it's all the same. But when you start to practice, you start to understand that, yeah, there's some similarities, but there's also some differences. And it helps you understand what some of those differences are, and, you know, helps you understand the data a little bit better.
네, 답변 잘 들었습니다. 이번엔 두 번째 질문인데요. 마음의 경험에 의해서 뇌 구조가 이렇게 새롭게 형성되기도 하고 재조직화된다는 그 뇌의 가소성이 후생 유전학의 어떤 이론과 어떤 연결이 될 수 있을까라는 질문입니다.
I'm going to answer the question. I'm going to address something you said before I answer your question. Actually, I'll answer your second question first. So, right. So your question is it related to epigenetics? Yes. There's a little bit of evidence to suggest that potentially, well, the most evidence has been shown with telomeres. So for chromosomes are long strands of DNA. And to keep the ends of the DNA from unraveling, there's something called telomeres, which is just these proteins that wrap around the ends to keep them all tightly wound. And it turns out that as we age, the telomeres get shorter, and if we're stressed out or sick, they get shorter versus where we're healthy, they get longer. And there's been some studies demonstrating that meditation helps lengthen the telomeres. I think you may hear more about that tomorrow, maybe. So yes, potentially there's impacts on epigenetics. But I also want to point out, so the hippocampus is one area of the brain where you can actually get new neurons. The rest of the brain, probably it's not new neurons. Probably what's happening is that you can think of neurons looking sort of like trees with lots of branches and lots of roots. And so we're born with all the neurons. Most of the neurons we're going to have our whole life. You know, we're born with them. But we can greatly change the number of branches and the number of roots. And we can also change where the branches are going. So the branches may be going here, but then we can move them over here instead. And so we think that that's what's happening in the other brain regions besides the hippocampus, that it's not new neurons, but it's the number of branches and roots and or where the branches and roots are located.
네, 감사합니다. 세 번째 질문입니다. 유독 그 사라 라자르 교수님께 질문이 많이 쏟아지는 것 같은데요. fMRI를 통한 그 뇌의 구조적 변화를 시사한다는 연구에서 그 연구 대상이 되는 각각의 명상 수련의 내용이 서로 혼용되거나 중복되는 경우는 없는지에 대한 질문입니다. 예를 들면 이렇게 호흡 명상을 하는데 뭐 자연스럽게 윗바사나 명상도 동시에 진행되는 경우가 있을 수 있는데요. 그렇다면 어떤 유형에 속하는 명상법인지 정확한 구분이 어려워진다고 봅니다.
Yes, that's a very great question, and it's a very real issue. So yes, in our studies, we can't, with the long-term practitioners, we can't really distinguish that. There have been a few attempts to do that, but it's hard, especially if someone's been practicing for many years, to say, okay, this is how much shamatha they've practiced and this is how vipassana they've practiced and whatnot. So the idea is that it's the combination of all the different practices. And so, it's, and in a way, because most people do practice a combination of different practices. And so I think it's more legitimate to show it as the sum of all their practice. There have also been some studies with just 8 weeks where they teach people, and we've done this as well, one group gets one type of meditation and another group gets another type of meditation. And we find that there are some similarities, but there's also some differences. So I like to think of it sort of like exercise. In terms of all forms of exercise are good for cardiovascular benefit, but this form of exercise might be a little bit better for your arms, and this one might be a little bit better for your legs. And it seems like with the meditation and the yoga, that all are generally beneficial for attention and stress, but that some forms of yoga or meditation might be this brain versus that brain region, or this one's maybe a little bit better for cognition and this one's a little bit better for stress maybe. But there's not enough data yet to say that.
네, 감사합니다. 그렇다면 우리 사라 라자르 교수님과 우리 함께 이렇게 어떤 명상 현장 실습을 한번 하는 시간을 한번 가져보면 어떨까 싶은데 가능할지요? 예, 한번 좀 진행해봐 주실까요? 예.
Yeah. Of course. This is great. Sure. So we'll just do a few minutes. So get comfortable. You can be sitting in a chair just normally, and you can keep your eyes open or closed, whatever you prefer. And what you want to do, I like to start wide. So look around the room and get a sense of the space that you're in. And what does it feel like to be in this space? Right? So how do you know if you're in a large room, if you're there in the amphitheater, how do what does it feel like to be in the amphitheater versus if you're at home, perhaps in a chair or in your office? It's a much smaller space. How does it feel to be in that space versus in a big space? So just getting a sense of the space around you. And then bringing attention in to just say like a foot or so around us, like our personal space bubble. What does that space feel like? And then bringing attention into just an inch or two, a few centimeters from around our body. And what does that feel like? And now we're going to go inside our body. So bringing attention into the torso and getting a sense of all that space inside of our body. And what does that feel like? And now let's check in with our mind. Perhaps our mind is busy and active and thinking about everything you've heard. Perhaps you're a little sleepy. Perhaps you're bored. Perhaps you're thinking about something completely different. Or perhaps it's quiet and settled. Doesn't matter. Just notice how your mind actually is right now. And then bringing attention to breathing sensations. It might be at the nostrils. It might be in the chest. It might be down the belly. How do you know you're breathing? What are the sensations that you notice that let you know that you're breathing and alive? And as you inhale and exhale, what are the sensations? Can you feel your muscles expanding and contracting? Can you feel the flow of air through your nostrils? And just bringing awareness to that. In this open, curious, non-judgmental way. And if you notice that your mind is not liking this and starting to wander, just saying, just for a few minutes, we're going to do this. And bringing it back gently. Perhaps sweeping attention through the body and noticing if there's any tension, letting that go. Letting the arms relax, letting the belly relax. And then bringing attention back to breathing. Noticing if you're breathing fast or slow, shallow or deep. Doesn't matter. Just knowing what you're knowing what your experience is. Noticing connection with the chair, with your feet on the ground. Just whatever the sensations is, being okay with them, finding that equanimity. Now let's check in with the mind again and see how it's changed over these past few minutes. Perhaps it's still active. perhaps it's calmed down a bit. And just noticing how even just a few minutes can change how your mind is. And slowly bring attention back to the surface of our body. Head to toe. And then expanding to just the space right around us, our personal space bubble. And then expanding out into the whole room. Opening eyes, wiggling fingers and toes, giving a little stretch. And just noticing how you feel now compared to how you felt 10 minutes ago. Oftentimes people say to me, "Oh, I don't have time to practice. I'm so busy. And what I see for myself is that often when I'm really busy and really stressed out, that's when I most need the practice. And that although I might lose a few minutes of time to practice, I gain it back. Because I'll be like, oh my God, I'm busy. I've got all this to do in my mind, and I'm not really focused. But if I can practice for just a few minutes, I'm calm, I'm centered, I'm focused again. And so even though I've lost a few minutes to practice, I've gained so much more because my mind is now focused and able to work more clearly and more effectively. So, hopefully this will encourage you to practice, even if you feel like you don't have any time whatsoever. So I think there's time for one or two more questions maybe.